Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Yeah, my name is Johanna Koljonen and I'm from Finland originally, but I'm in Malmö, Sweden now, which is just across the bridge from Copenhagen. It's the bridge from the TV series The Bridge, if you're into Nordic noir. I'm going to talk today about Nordic Larp, which is an art form. It's a medium that has a history that is related to games. And I should say immediately that if you know LARP as in its, let's say, for instance, most American incarnations, you might find a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today quite surprising and different. I want to start by saying that every kind of LARP is absolutely valid. It's just not, every kind of LARP is just not what I do. And I'd like to start by just showing you a film that I find very pedagogical from the creative director of my company.
The human brain is very bad at distinguishing between reality and fiction. It does not mean that we don't understand what is reality and fiction, but in the moment when you're experiencing it, the brain has all the same reactions as if it was real. Studies have shown that if you change your physicality or you put on a costume or you're given an alibi to behave differently, you change your behavior automatically as a human being. So for example, if you put on a lab coat, you become more decisive and you will become more authoritative in your language and in your body posture. And that happens unconsciously. It's the same thing in LARP. My name is Bjarke Pedersen. I've been LARPing for more than 20 years and designing for equally as long. LARP stands for live action roleplay, and Nordic LARP is a specific subset where we focus on collaborative storytelling. There's many reasons why people engage in LARP, and for some, of course, it's escapism, but I think the main reason is to be able to step into somebody else's shoes for a while. You get a chance to see how other people function, and when you engage with characters that are profoundly different from you, you will learn that that character is also part of you, and that maybe you can enhance the possibilities you have in your own life of engaging with other people. I think there's a movement toward being more active in stories, and one of the big reasons, of course, that we spend so much time passively consuming stuff on screens. But people want to engage with stories, they want to contribute, and they want to be able to step into these worlds together and share moments with other fans. So in traditional storytelling, you often follow one or several characters. Here, the only character you can engage with directly is your own. So you don't have one main character, you have 100 main characters. All participants need to feel like the hero of their own journey. You have to build trust amongst the participants to be able to play together and to be vulnerable together and tell stories that are serious and fun and dangerous. Because without feeling safe, you can't be brave. And only by being brave, you can allow yourself to play around and be something that you are not. The way I see a LARP is like a big interaction machine. So I create all the cogs in the wheels, and the cogs are the characters, it's the world, it's the morality of the world. But as the players and their input are put into this interaction machine, there will be an output. And that output is each individual has their own story told by themselves, and it is a unique story. So whatever happens is the right thing as long as they adhere to the rules of the world. Then you have to trust your participants to explore the theme that you have set within the given framework, and they will tell way more beautiful stories than you could ever imagine yourself.
Yes. LARP stands for live action roleplay, and actually in the US and in a lot of the Anglophone world, the word LARP is capitalized. That's a bit of a shibboleth if somebody is writing it like I do. It's often a sign that they're in some kind of conversation with the type of LARP that I'm participating in or doing. I like that video because because it summarizes in a sort of very accessible way some very big theory concepts or like design theory work that we've done for in our community for over 20 years. And I was a high school student when I picked up this hobby. It was then very much sort of fantasy stories told out in forests. We have ample outdoor areas in the Nordic countries that are free to use for anyone, even private land you can use up to a point. So it's very easy for us to tell those kinds of stories when we're teenagers. And there are many other structural reasons that I won't really have time to go into why the Nordic countries had enabled a lot of things at the same time. And that became important. But one that I do have to mention is early internet penetration. So as early as the mid-90s, a lot of these communities that were role-playing communities who had invented independently live role-playing, as happened all over the world. In the Nordic countries, we started talking to each other very early, like 94, 95, 96, and traveling to other communities because we hooked up online and playing other people's LARPs. And also very early on from 1997, there is an annual conference which is focused on the craft of designing LARP. So even though these events are completely ephemeral and only exist for that one shot, like one performance, we were able to learn from each other very rapidly in a way that just randomly didn't happen in many other kinds of the world. So, and we obsessively documented, because a lot of us are also just like design nerds. So we started obsessively documenting our work as well. So we have a pretty good idea of why certain things work better than others for different purposes. This is now relevant in a lot of other media fields, whether you're making theme parks, and indeed if you go to Star Wars land, you're going to find that a lot of Nordic LARP ideas have been very directly applied. People from our communities and also Imagineers have been visiting us for the last 10 years or so, and vice versa. But also if you're in VR, if you're in many kinds of other kinds of digital gaming, for instance, we're in a lot of places, we're approaching points in media where you have worlds where you want to tell stories that give the participant agency, full agency, or the illusion of full agency, and allow them to experience stories together. And there is a craft to this. This is not some kind of mystical problem that is unsolvable. Largely, most of the narrative problems around this and a lot of the participation design problems around this have been solved in LARP, and in particular in Nordic LARP. I also won't go so much into this slide in the interest of time, but I want to just say that the term role-playing goes back to the 1910s and 20s in Vienna. It was invented by Jacob Moreno, and there's a very interesting timeline how that eventually is attached to tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons after they have already been published. People who are aware of role-playing in its other meanings attach that term to those kinds of games, and then that kind of becomes the dominant meaning. But there are also many other historical types of performativity and embodied art forms of different kinds that also lead into what becomes LARP and freeform, and Nordic LARP belongs there. It has one foot solidly in what is today called serious games. It has certainly a lot of interactions with performance and theater, and a lot of us who are grown-ups practitioners of this may have started on the hobby side, but also have some like a solid education in the arts of some kind, and of course inevitably that also affects it. Most importantly, what is different in Nordic LARP, if I'd have to say just one thing from every other kind of LARP in the world, is its extreme focus on bespoke design. So if you were to go to a LARP in the US, again, for all kinds of structural and historical reasons, they would tend to be systems-based. That is, that the idea of designing a LARP in a lot of countries, also in continental Europe, that would be the case, is designing a world and a rule set. And the rule set, and that is like a massive sandbox, and the idea is that you can run a campaign, a series of events that could cover any kind of story, any kind of hypothetical situation needs to be enabled and adjudicated by the rules and the world that you create. So that becomes an incredibly complex piece of design. The other thing is they tend to also be competitive, so you have to put a lot of focus into how to fairly adjudicate conflicts, narrative conflicts or competition elements in the story, because they are often more clearly games. Nordic LARPs tend to not be games by most definitions of game. Because Nordic LARPs were of this type that I'm talking about, campaign gaming certainly also exists here, but because for random, again, historical coincidences, our LARPs tend to be one-shots, you can optimize the design of that one event, the story and the rule sets of that one event for whatever the themes, like what are you trying to achieve this one time? And then that's what you design. So every event becomes bespoke, and there are new skills and new things, the new interaction patterns can be tested as well for each event. And of course, that also led to us learning faster than some others. Yes, I'm realizing this is another video right here. I'll just let you see a little bit of clips because I think there might be sound on this one as well. Let's see if I can affect that here. Yeah. So I'll just talk on top of this. This is some IP work that my agency does. We like sometimes to also make like commercial LARPs, for instance, brand activations. And here we work with White Wolf, who own one of the most successful tabletop role-playing and computer role-playing IPs in the world, the World of Darkness. And we created an event for them in Berlin. Well, it's actually a series of events, but it culminated in this LARP in across 11 locations in Friedrichshain, where the participants got to experience living as vampires and werewolves in this incredibly cool environment for one night. And these were super fans who had flown in from all over the world to Berlin to have this experience. And they paid a couple of $100 for the whole convention and all of the things that it involved. And these are things that, so sometimes the business model to do this can be about brand activation. But the important thing about this job was that we were able to make a deal with the IP owner that the outcome of this event would become canonically true inside the fiction. The World of Darkness has a sort of timeline that progresses in real time. So when the Anarchs of Berlin took out the prince, this actually became canonically true in the context of that whole fictional universe, and it's still true if you go to if you play any of the games that are coming out now and so on. And I'm going to show you some extreme examples because, of course, I want to brag a little bit about the coolest things we've done. So I'll tell you about another LARP we made in collaboration with White Wolf. This one, for reasons that are unclear to me, they chose not to communicate this, so almost nobody knows about this. But this is an actual LARP that we made in the European Parliament. That is the actual European Parliament, so it would be, like, I guess, equivalent to maybe doing it in your Congress or something like that. So what you're seeing, this is an actual play photo. What you're seeing here is our participants in this LARP, some of whom are actual European Parliament staff portraying some fictional meetings, right? But everybody's behaving also, because that was the only way we could have access to this high security installation, was that everybody behaves all through the day as though this is a real thing that is happening. But of course, all the people we were actually in touch with knew that this was art, right? And if you know anything about the World of Darkness, these vampires, like, ostensibly they affect like a lot of the politics of the world, but they can't go out in daylight. So we thought, like, how does that even work? Like, how do you control politics if you can't go out in the daylight? And the canonical answer to this is through ghouls and lobbyists. So we said, would there be some people in the world who are super fans of this fiction, but who are also policy wonks, and who would find it interesting to get to go to the European Parliament and play out policy, like real world political debates in these real environments? And we designed it so one of the designers was working in the European Parliament at the time, which is what made it possible. Maria Pettersson is her name, and she collaborated with actual Parliament staff to give the people real briefings on actual real world discussions, like visa rules, blood bank regulation, things that would be relevant if you're a vampire or if your boss is a vampire. And then the people had real meetings in the Parliament building. And here, for instance, well, I can't point to the screen now, but both the blonde lady here in the front and the lady with the glasses in the bottom right-hand corner, these are actual members of the European Parliament. So again, the equivalent largely of your Congress people, who are playing fictional versions of themselves, who happen to know or not know that these vampires exist. One of them is playing, in fact, an evil version of themselves. And you can see here, for instance, this venue is really interesting. So, for instance, one player here is hiding in the translator booth to listen to some secret proceedings. Sometimes when you run events at difficult locations, maybe don't be super specific about asking for permission. I think they would probably not have allowed that. They probably also would not have been super excited about the occult ritual in the basement, but everything went fine and we were able to do this. Yeah. All of these wonderful pictures are by Tuomas Puikkonen, who's one of the greatest LARP photographers in the world. It's very difficult because these are not actors, right? These are ordinary participants who embody these characters, it looks different when you LARP someone as when you act someone. And the reason it looks different is that when you're acting, your direction is outwards. You're performing for somebody outside yourself, largely, even if you're a method actor. If you're LARPing, we talk about you have a first-person audience. It's what's happening inside your experience, inside your body. That's the interface to the story. And it makes what happens in your face is quite different, and it's difficult. It often looks like bad acting unless you're in it. But Thomas, I feel, has the ability to take pictures that show how it feels. And these were some of our other venues. We actually had a cocktail reception on top of that Arc de Triomphe there. And there was some action sequence as well. But like largely, this was a pretty boring LARP about incredibly boring meetings. But it was also very small. And it was like, could we find 30 people who'd be willing to pay, I can't remember what it was now, but let's say $900 for this incredibly exclusive experience about European policymaking and vampires? And the answer was yes, we could. So that pretty much covered the cost. Now the question is like, how does this feel? And I'll just show you this picture. This is another one of the meetings during the LARP. And if you look at the second person from the left, that looks perhaps as a very passive face. It's a Finnish LARPer. But he shared with us later elevated heart rate notifications and matched them against, like he knew where he had been because we had a really detailed schedule. So he knew that his heartbeat was up there, right up there, over 120, at least twice during this meeting. And, you know, he's a Finnish man. I'm also Finnish, but, you know, my face is all over the place. But that is not how, in my culture, normally you're very like controlled and deadpan. So you can't tell it from his face. But the answer is it feels amazing. Like it's really exciting to act in a fictional world so that your actions have consequences for the fiction. So that's when I'm talking about full agency. What I mean is it's not just you're taken on a ride, like you're in an immersive theater piece and you get to see something that somebody else doesn't see, but your actions have zero effect on the overall outcome. Here, everybody affects everybody, right? So the character is the interface to the story. And I would say, specifically in Nordic LARP, the body is the interface to the character. And of course, you share the chemistry, like if you're emoting, when you are experiencing emotions and perceptions, the character and the player body will overlap. In Nordic LARP, typically the fictional body looks very much like the player's body, but you don't have to do that. That's a design choice. But even when you would say that they're very different for some reason, even if you make that choice, I would argue that the body is still the interface. And then, yeah, everyone is the main character, and trust among the participants is completely key to this. So I'm not just a designer, I'm also a fan, and I'll just show some picture from other people's LARPs. This is from a Westworld experience made by Not Only LARP I don't know what I'm calling a Westworld experience, as though we're at South by Southwest. All right, this is a LARP created by a Spanish outfit called Not Only LARP, largely Esperanza Montero, who's a great designer. And basically, this is actually the place where they shot The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and they just built up this Westworld situation there. And you could play a host, that is one of the robots, or you could play a guest, or you could play staff. And we got to live all the horrors of Westworld there. Now, I think if you'd go to like an immersive thing, Westworld thing, you're obviously not allowed to experience or tell any of the stories about physical violence and oppression and horror that are such a big part of Westworld. But this format allows it because of its basic structure, this idea that you're not here competitively, you're not ever there, you're not ever LARPing in these types of LARPs. So that somebody else has to pay for your fun. You're always there for the collective experience. How do we create interesting stories for everybody? And then the question is, what would it take? Like what kind of consent negotiations do we need to be able to portray sex work in this fiction in a way that is respectful, for instance? What kinds of violence? How do we portray this violence in a way that is very fluid so that people can control what they're willing to be, what kinds of scenes they're willing to participate in, but that they can also negotiate up or down in the intensity of the story or the intensity of the physical interactions at any given moment. And there's a lot of craft for this, and we know how to do this. I had a great experience at this LARP. Basically, a key term here is interaction alibi. It's one of mine. I've done a lot of theory in this field. So an interaction alibi is the thing that permits you to act in a way that you wouldn't normally, because you'd feel embarrassed, or you'd feel like you're taking a social risk, or you feel like it wouldn't be appropriate or something. So a very simple idea of an interaction alibi is a mask. So you go to a masquerade and people will behave slightly differently because they feel like they can. Or just in any situation, you're given another social role in any kind of real world situations, or you're somebody in authority gives you instructions, and those also become like alibis. I was just listening to a podcast. I don't know where you are. A lot of you are probably in the United States. I was just hearing some New Yorkers discuss how they'd been talking to strangers in a way that they wouldn't have normally when the election results came out, and then the results of the election in your country become an alibi to interact differently than you normally would, right? I'll just show some more, just like flavor, to get an idea what this is. This is from a really nice LARP called Lotka Volterra, which was this sort of post-apocalyptic bunker. Here, some kind of fae high fantasy thing. There's them being tortured in very, very safe ways, I should say, but it looks very terrifying. In the middle picture, and in the picture on the right, that's actually a LARP that's going to run again next year. It's called Forbidden History. It's a kind of LARP. It's a LARP very deeply inspired by Donna Tartt's novel, The Secret History. If you're into that, you can go to a castle in Poland and play that, and have me as your poetry teacher there. Everyone is the main character, and that's the challenge of how do you design these worlds so that every story becomes just as interesting. And one of the design narrative challenges for this is, of course, that if everyone is the main character but they also have full agency, then the outcome, no matter what their individual outcome is, it has to be just as satisfying. And that means that these LARPs cannot be competitive. That is to say, the characters, the fictional situations can have competition in there, but the fun or the meaning, because a lot of these stories are not fun, but a lot of the meaning of the experience, the amount of meaning of the experience can't be connected to the character always succeeding in their goals, because per definition, not all characters can succeed in their goals, unless you have a lot of extras who are playing all the enemies, so to speak, and that's also a way that's typically, for instance, how US LARPs are constructed. So equality of outcome, every outcome has to be just as valuable. And we talk about play to lose. Americans hate this term because losing is so stigmatized in your culture largely. So for Americans, we say play for story. What we mean is you play for the interesting outcome, right? So if you read a novel or if you watch a film, you don't always want the hero to succeed. Sometimes failure or tragedy are just as important or meaningful. In fact, very often failure and tragedy are just as important or meaningful, almost succeeding. That story is a much more satisfying story than always succeeding, right? And I'll just throw in for my last minute, some more pictures just to show some range. This is a Finnish-Palestinian co-production, Halat Hisar, State of Siege, which is been produced a couple of times with fine arts funding in Finland, where Finnish and Palestinian designers created this alternative history where the situation and the illegal occupation of Palestine has happened in Finland, and the occupiers are a fictional nation of Euralians. And then this LARP was about what is it like to go to university, what is it like to live your everyday life under occupation. And this is actually, and all the Middle Eastern players were playing, or all the Palestinian players were actually playing the equivalent of like Western NGO workers and international journalists and so on. This is a workshop picture because it turned out that we Nordics were terrible at protesting. So they had to like teach us the craft of protesting because we physically did not know anything. Like we thought we knew about protesting. I'm like, I was a teenager, around the turn of the millennium. I protested a lot. I protest every year for weekly almost for the climate still. Yeah, not this kind of protesting. So I had to learn some skills. But again, it can be anything. One of the most famous LARPs in the world is a Norwegian piece, but it's been produced in a lot of countries. I think it's on its 12th production now, called Just a Little Love, and it's set in upstate New York on the 4th of July of 83, 84, and 85, and it's about how the AIDS epidemic strikes that generation of primarily gay players. Obviously, the designers also are queer, and they are designing the stories about their own history, and that LARP, of course, also attracts a lot of sexual and gender minority players, because it's very rare in any medium to be in a fiction where you are and your concerns are the norm. It sounds like an incredibly tragic story, and of course it is very sad, but it turned out, I think, to everybody's surprise, when you play it, it becomes about friendship and hope and joy, which is a reminder, I think, also in this moment that we're in, that that sometimes, you know, afterwards some of the stories will be about light. Suffragette obviously is about like, there are a lot of other types of historical LARPs like the ones about the suffrage movement, but they can also be very conceptual. So The Perfect Human is a one-day LARP about life in an office in stock photos. So you all know what people like stock photo offices look like. Everybody is happy and supportive and like shiny, and they are pointing at things, and everybody's always constructive. And the designers and also the photographing actually of this LARP was a big part of the piece. But the designers are very much were asking, okay, what would it actually feel like? Would it become a dystopian? How does it feel to live in a stock photo for like 6 hours? And actually, the answer, apparently I haven't played it, but the answer is it's great. Like, it just feels great to get that level of support all the time. And working in offices would be kind of awesome if it was like that, except that it's also exhausting. So we don't actually want to always have to be that happy. Yeah. I'm showing you mostly pictures of LARPs that have like a 360-degree visual surface, because they just look better in pictures. But a really big part of LARPs are, for instance, right now, the black box LARP, where a lot of the best design, or the most cutting edge design, has been happening in the last 10 years, because we're still learning more about that form. And those are produced in a theater black box. They typically have a length of about 4 hours, including onboarding and de-rolling afterwards, because there's this sort of circuit of black box LARP festivals where the time slots often are 4 hours. So it's also a very sort of low threshold way to start this. And a lot of LARP scripts are available online to download, and you can produce them yourself. Very often they have very pedagogical guides for how to do that. And then, of course, starting with small chamber LARPs or black box LARPs is a good idea. Yeah. Okay, so now it is past, so I'll just rush through these last few pictures. I just wanted to show you another like signature piece of ours. This is called Inside Hamlet, and it's a 3-day Hamlet that we're producing at Castle Elsinore in Elsinore, which is a place in Denmark. It's less than an hour from the airport in Copenhagen. And this, as you see, is a Renaissance castle. So this was actually a very famous building in Shakespeare's time. In his fiction, he places it in the medieval castle, which was there before. But it's famous. This was a building that was famous the way like the World Trade Center, or maybe Empire State Building is a better comparison. It's famous in that way. Like, it was a globally known building, so of course they'd put it there. And we are able to play inside some of the spaces in the castle. And when we did actually the first run of this in, I think, 2015 or 17 in the castle, was the first time that Hamlet had been performed inside the castle for 100 years. They do use the courtyard for theater in the summers. So again, even in this piece, even the title characters, if you're playing Hamlet or Polonius or Claudius or any of these people, Gertrude and so on, Ophelia, you're still a paying participant, but you have to come one day earlier, because there are certain scenes, like there are certain story beats that you have to hit, and we, in this design, we sort of pause play in a couple of places to hear soliloquies, just because people who play this LARP love the text, so they want to hear the text. But again, so in the end, like, the people who tended to play those parts tend to be LARPers and actors, so that they have the skill of just memorizing big chunks of text. But everybody else who plays the members of this court are just participants and as free to act as otherwise. And I'll just show you, and actually you can go on the website, it's still there, insidehamlet.com. Under Is This LARP For Me, you can find the following text. Let's see if I can get this visible. Yeah. This LARP is played in a very physical style where dancing is dancing and fighting looks real. Real alcohol will be served, but players deemed too intoxicated to participate responsibly will be removed from play. Alcohol-free options always available. All genders, sexualities, and bodies are invited to act wicked and be beautiful at this LARP. During play, you are likely to become witness to nudity, public displays of affection and sexuality, or simulated but realistic-looking sex, violence, or drug taking. A good minimum comfort level for participation is for you to be able to hold hands with or kiss a stranger lightly on the cheek. But whether gentle intimacy, portrayed lust, or pretend violence, you will always have full control of your own body and of the story you are playing. You always choose who to touch and control who touches you. You can always leave any situation and step outside the play area to take a break from the fiction as needed. And these are big promises, but I think these are just like basic hygiene promises in any kind of participatory art form. I don't know, it feels like I've been coming down on immersive theater hard in this talk. I don't mean to, I also love it, but I feel like performance art, immersive theater, multiplayer VR are like so far behind on thinking about consent. And it really annoys me because these aren't mystical things. These are things that are resolved. So this LARP has a 3-arc structure. The first act is about decadence, and it can look something like this. These are all actual play photos. The second is about deception, and there's also this sort of war game element. We are fighting for Timbras at the same time, and everybody turns on everybody, and the rules are different so that the conflicts automatically escalate. And then the last, of course, this is a Shakespeare tragedy, so the last act is about death, and at the end, indeed, most characters are already dead, and if you're not, by the time Fortinbras enters with his Marxist rebels, they will line the survivors up against the wall and shoot them. And then all the players have been told that they have the choice at that moment. If they feel that their character deserves to live, they remain standing at that moment. And if they feel that they don't deserve to live, they fall. And this LARP is very much, it's a sort of 70s reading of the play, but it is supported by the text. It's about how the corruption of the leadership of the state becomes a corruption or in the body politic. And these people in this fiction, this is sort of also last days bunker, the dictator's last days experience in a way. So this insanity that is happening in this very privileged environment during the last 3 months when they are under siege, and they are realizing that all of their privileges are slipping away. And I'm realizing as I'm saying this how topical this is again. I'm sorry. But the thing is, it's always topical. Like this LARP is always topical. And players with very different backgrounds have experienced it very differently, including people from, players from Israel, players from Belarus. Like it reads very differently depending on where you're from, but it can be very powerful regardless. So I'm just going to end you with some terminology. I think it's interesting to make a distinction between physical consent and story consent. Story consent is what kinds of situations can I be exposed to and part of, and physical consent is like what can be done to my body and what can I be expected to participate in. And in fact, when we were running one of our vampire nightclub LARPs in New Orleans to American players who had no previous experience of physical LARPing, afterwards, one of the female players said, "This is the first time in my life that I felt fully in control of who touches my body." And that is both heartbreaking and powerful. Like that was not our design goal, was about how do we enable strangers to embody these fictional relationships and to play in this fictional nightclub. But it turns out it can also be quite powerful to get to have this embodied experience. Yeah. So if it might feel a little bit like science fiction to say like, oh, but how do you even design behaviors? How do you design culture? Well, everything that is man-made is designed in some way, and either it's designed iteratively, or somebody made some choices earlier, it's become tradition and we just continue doing the same way, or we decide to change something because the old way of doing something doesn't serve us anymore, and then it's design, right? And this is a big sign that we have at the office in our the wall in our office, when at some point in the future I'll be allowed to go back to my office. And everything is a designable surface, including temperature and the tone of voice in your communication and the emotions of your participants. Everything is a designable surface. Yes, I'm going to end here. That's my email address. On top is Johanna@participation.design. I've also edited a book called LARP Design. So if you're making any kind of participatory experiences, you may want to get a copy of this You can order it online at bookshop.se. That's the English bookshop in Sweden, bookshop.se, or you can just email me and I'll make sure you get a copy somehow. Not available as an ebook yet because the corona just stopped that right there. Yes, I'm ending sharing here. I realize I went over time. My apologies.
Yeah, no worries. That was
we are.
awesome.
Thanks.
A lot of rich areas we can go in, and unfortunately we have to leave about 5 minutes before the hour because we have an event starting at the top of the hour. But so we can only squeeze in a few questions. I have two. So this kind of skill set of LARP design and then these LARP games, I imagine they can be serviced to many different intentions, like just for fun, maybe creating an art piece, marketing a product like that vampire werewolf thing, therapy, personal development, activism. Is there like a
education?
Yeah, education. Yeah. Is there like a taxonomy of ones that are active right now or more active in certain parts of the world?
There are a lot of people in contemporary art who were already doing relational things that are really getting into LARP methodology in different ways. Sometimes they've come across it sort of randomly, the way like you have, and sometimes through association, like stumbling over the hobby part. Education is big, and in many, like there, for instance, in Denmark, there are a couple of boarding schools for like 10th graders where they do a lot of like role-playing based pedagogy in general, and then the LARP is a big part of that. But also in Sweden, there are companies that create like educational edu-LARPs that you can, that fit specific curricula for, that can go to schools and so on. So that's, if you want to live doing this, that's a big part. But to be honest, I feel like as a participation consultant, we end up using a lot of these skill sets, just helping arts institutions make, we design exhibitions with museums and things like that. Any kind of participation, when you start to think about it in terms of, but there are rules, like, what is it that is hindering the participant from doing the action that they want to do? How do I enable them? Like, what are the physical barriers, shame barriers? How do I hack that? It's absolutely possible to do that. So our LARP work is a lot of our also R&D for our like mainstream consulting.
And I was going to ask you a question on Bleed, because that's how I discovered the LARP, and that's going to be the title of your new podcast. Or it's going to be in your title of your new podcast. I'm going to just read Christian's questions, if that's okay, because it's related to it.
Sure.
Any stories about LARPing deeply changing someone's life? Any stories about LARPing gone wrong? People get too affected by their character or their story, which is related to the Bleed concept.
Yeah. Okay. So just bleed is a term for when. So it sounds very dramatic. It sounds like blood coming out of you, and that's what it can feel like in your heart. But really, what it means is more like bleed, like ink going through a paper, for instance, right? So that when you are playing and you're using your own body and you're using your own experiences to embody a fictional character, obviously you're going to be using yourself, like your real life is bleeding in. And when you're having experiences, even though the social construct is that the situation and the narrative is fictional, the actions are still real in the sense, and the social reality is real while it exists, in the sense that we are actually doing those things and we're saying those words. And even when we're doing it very safely, it has still happened. And now I think there are many other contexts like extreme sports or mountain climbing or BDSM or circus. Like there are so many other spaces where humans do incredibly extreme things with each other, and they're more or less good at consent and risk management. I would say this field largely is very, very good, because LARP hasn't historically had the kind of status that sports or performance art, for instance, have, where it's acceptable socially in society to take risks with people. That said, the majority of the practitioners are just like untrained fans who are making these pieces for each other. And I'm sure that there are a lot of like 17-year-old designers who don't make great choices. On the other hand, they are also not so skilled, so their work is often not so impactful. But there is a lot in this form. The form in itself is surprisingly powerful. A lot of people who LARP, the first LARPs they went to were terrible. Like they were shit, like from a technical, like from a design perspective. But just the experience of living in the fictional reality becoming real around you, and not so much playing another character, but living another social role. Like now suddenly I'm somebody's sister or somebody's king or somebody's, subject. And I've never experienced that before. And and it becomes real because everybody else treats it as though it's real. That is actually really powerful. And there's a lot of grief often after LARPs, like immediately, because the fictional relationships felt real and everything you did had meaning, because obviously, like in narratives, you tend to do meaningful things, and that your meaningful quest disappears and your friends that you were really invested in 5 minutes ago are no longer there. So we put a lot of care in like, how do you exit these experiences in a way that feels nice? I don't actually know about LARPs causing like, for instance, like mental health issues, but it's very clear that LARPs can absolutely trigger pre-existing issues, just like any other kind of extreme experience would. If you don't sleep, then it's more about those things, like you don't sleep enough because everything that's happening is so interesting. So even people who are pretty good at taking care of existing conditions can sometimes just like, or you forget to take your meds because you're doing something intense. And there also, I would say, like, it's more dangerous, significantly more dangerous to go to a burn than to go to a LARP. But but I would say the transformative potential is the same. Yeah.
Very cool. I'm going to take in Adam.
Well, let me just pull up my question really quick. It's still pretty early for me, so I might have to read it. What is on the frontier of LARPing, and where would you like to see the boundaries being pushed? Is there anything that particularly excites you at the moment? Any area?
Yes, I'll just answer. Somebody was just asking, like, what is a burn? I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking, because for me it's late in the day. A burn, like Burning Man, events like that, where people engage in risky behavior, often physically risky behavior, sometimes also on drugs and so on. We're very hard on, like, not, for instance, taking substances while we play, and alcohol. Also, just let's limit that because it's intense enough as it is, and you need to be able to control your impulses. So it's those, we don't believe in those combinations inside this community. Yeah. What's on the forefront of LARP? Well, so a year ago, I would have said that Destination LARP has really found its shape. And Destination LARP is when you travel somewhere like Elsinore or castles in Poland, which you can rent for cheap, like really cheap. So it's great for production, but you get great production value to do like a weekend experience. And a lot of people, it becomes like largely a middle-class hobby. Like everybody in my family played golf. I'm not gonna play golf, but I'm not gonna fly to New York or Paris for a weekend. Like I just don't think that. But I could take a train to Berlin and then a bus to Poland, and go to a LARP and spend a similar amount of money on like a really high-end experience. And there's actually a kind of market for that. And because it's often a very political community, people also tend to enable, like, there are different financial structures to make cheaper tickets available, so that also, for instance, students and slightly less well-off players can play. And like, that's from a business perspective. It's interesting to me that there's starting to be a business model for that now. I think for all kinds of corona-related reasons and climate-related reasons, we're going to have to look at how to do that. I believe more in touring LARPs. But the real cutting edge thing, I think, is that because we've been able to formalize the design skills, because there are some good books now. There's a lot of material online for how to do this, and there are a lot of people who know how to do this. That the LARP design tools are becoming available in disenfranchised communities of different kinds, so that people with very different backgrounds from the sort of like the class structure of the Nordic countries. I'm not even going to go into that. It's a whole thing. But like, basically, for all kinds of reasons, mainly because a huge chunk of the population is white and middle class in these countries. This hobby also has been historically white and middle class, and that has shaped the art form. Like all art forms largely have been white and middle class in my part of the world. Whatever, that sucks. Yes. But now finally, it's possible to learn these skills also in some other way than through massive exposure to other people's LARPs. And there are a lot of people who are working with distributing them. There's a really exciting, like the Palestinian designers are distributing LARP design in neighboring countries. Super exciting. very exciting work being done in London with underprivileged communities. I know that in the US, there are a lot of indie designers who are US designers, but who are very aware also of this sort of Northern European design discourse, or who are specifically working in the sort of international Nordic Larp community, who are also working with underprivileged communities where they live. And I think, to be honest, like that's going to be the best work, because like just that's in any art form. I work a lot with the film industry as well, and it's just relevance is going to go up when you get more voices telling stories. And I think that's what I'm like most psyched about personally right now.
Gordon, you had a question.
Yeah, I'm kind of trying to think how to. I'm overwhelmed by the content that you've presented already, and you know, it's a lot to digest. It resonates with a lot of things I'm thinking about. So I think the way I want to frame this, I propose a definition for LARP as being a lab for experiments in what Ken Wilber would call the intersubjective quadrant. And yeah, I wonder, is that a fair definition, or what does that definition leave out?
I'm looking at the clock. I don't know if we're going to cover all that. Well, to start with, the definition of LARP is already, as you may imagine, a very sort of contentious topic, and the definition of Nordic LARP even more so. If you try to Google the definition of Nordic LARP, you'll find some fun videos on this topic. I think that's a pretty good definition, though, and I think like a term that I'd like to mention in this context is interimmersion. And we talk a lot about immersive in, you know, meaning all kinds of things, and also within LARP we talk a lot about immersion into character, immersion into the environment, immersion into narrative, and we have a lot of like 20-year-old theory debates about like what kinds of immersion are actually real and blah blah blah. But I think there's a term that is interimmersion, which is that this idea that the thing that we are immersing into is something that is happening between us, and it's because you can't watch like our experience is that it's very difficult, maybe impossible, to watch a LARP from the outside. There have been some experiments in black boxes where it works pretty well if there are not too many participants, but basically you can't see it. Like you can't see the fiction unless you're inside. This is also why it's so difficult to photograph, right? So there is some kind of state that happens when people are acting the same fiction together, which is probably the same state that happens, you know, when people are acting any ritual together or any kind of like formalized social interaction. It's probably the same thing, especially if it has some kind of transformative or co-creative component. But that kind of co-attention that is happening there, which we call interimmersion when it's about like being inside the story, that is at the heart of this. And the power of that is like the key, I think, to why it becomes so powerful. And you are aware all the time. We talk about meta reflection also, like, so your attention goes on different levels in your mind. So you are acting inside the fiction strategically and emotionally with your own bodies and your own story and experience goals in different ways. But at the same time, of course, you know that this is not real. Even when you're in a flow state inside the fiction, which absolutely can happen, and you become automatic inside the fiction, you still know it's not real. And then where you are, like where is the text of the LARP is another big theory question, but I'm thinking maybe it's in the interimmersion. That's why it is by necessity ephemeral, like it's going to be gone. So it's not a bad definition. I welcome you to enter this fight.
I'll see you there.
Yeah.
One thing that caught my attention, you talked about like tradition is like the opposite, or design is the opposite of tradition. And in a way, like we are all kind of unconsciously LARPing some kind of script, some kind of story that we didn't design ourselves. We just adopted from the kind of the intersubjective space. In Samuel Berger, one of the sense makers here, he has this provocative dichotomy called live players versus dead players, and dead players only can operate by following a pre-existing script, or live players, you know, they can create new things and invent their own script, like self-author their own life, aka be authentic. It seems like this talent stack of Nordic LARP would really help building that muscle. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
No, I think it definitely does, because it makes visible the constructed nature, not just of like social reality, but also of societal systems and all of those things. I think like, well, I'm in my early 40s, so for me in the mid to late 90s, we were super inspired by thinking about, like, we were talking about a hacker mindset, right? We were reading a lot of cyberpunk and also thinking about like temporary autonomous zones, and I know Hacking Bay turned out to be super problematic, but there was those kinds of ideas that shaped our thinking there, and I always wondered, was that just was that a generational thing? And the answer is not a generational thing. Like, it seems that young people who are coming into this also are having the same experience. And in fact, there is something called, if you want to learn more about this, you can go to a very primitive website, which you will find if you just Google LARP Writer Summer School. And the LARP Writer Summer School was a project that was funded by the Norwegian Foreign Ministry as a democracy project for Belarus. Now, you can't do democracy projects in Belarus because it's a dictatorship, so we ran it in Lithuania. And for 5 years, we had students come in, mostly NGO staff and teachers. From half of the people were from Belarus, and those were mostly teachers or NGO people. And the others were just like LARP designers or wannabe LARP designers from other countries, all the way to Vietnam, actually, but mostly Europe. And we were teaching them to make EduLARPs, because the Norwegian Foreign Ministry, I don't know how they got this insight, but correctly, they realized that by teaching LARP design, making worlds, creating fictions, which we said that we're teaching them educational LARP design, which we were. They could absolutely use those skills to teach normal educational subjects, but actually we were teaching them democracy skills. So we were smuggling democracy into Belarus through this method of teaching LARP to teachers and activists. And the fact that somebody puts tax money into this project and did for 5 years, I think proves that this is not just inside this bubble that we think that this is the thing.
Mm. Yeah, and I have 100 more questions to ask you, but we probably have to close soon. So I just wanted to give you space to any kind of concluding thoughts. And also maybe another question I could sneak in there is, if we want to play some LARP game at the Stoa or learn how to design it, any recommendations on that?
Where are you physically based again?
I'm in Toronto, but we're all across the world.
All over, yeah. And that makes it hard. Of course, no, actually, there are a lot of really interesting digital LARP design, like online LARPs, to be playable by Zoom, that have been developed in particular during this game, during this year. I can hook you up with some, Peter, for recommendations later, because I don't have them off the top of my mind. Some resources, nordiclarp.org is a good portal to find all things Nordic LARP, and it's also, a lot of the editors are actually American. So it has this double view of not always being fully inside it, so that it's a little bit more accessible. And it also leads you to the Nordic LARP wiki, which is very spotty, but like the stuff that is there is very useful. And yeah, there is a book, for instance, called LARPs from the Factory, that just has a lot of books that you can, LARPs that you can play yourself. There's another one called #Feminism. I can't remember, I think it's on Pelgrane now, but if you look for #Feminism LARP anthology, you'll find this book. And it also has like really short LARPs from 5 minutes and up that you can just run off the page yourself as well. And you can email me for more things, and I'd be happy to come back and talk more another time.
Yeah, we would love to have you back for sure. So I'll make some closing thoughts, but Johanna, thanks so much for coming to the Stoa today. That was awesome.
Thank you all so much for listening to me at all of these weird times.
Yeah. And people were saying in the chats that this was an awesome presentation, both privately as well. So yeah, it was really good. So stoa.ca for more events. We have a Patreon and a Substack. And then coming up in 5 minutes is High Pitch. Benita Roy, Nora Bates, and a lot of ladies from the Stoa are having this beautiful embodied conversation. You can RSVP right there. So that being said, Johanna, everyone, thanks again for coming to the Stoa.
Thanks. Bye.